We resume the story in the book The Sunflower by Simon Wiesenthal at a point where Simon meets the SS officer who is dying in a makeshift ward in Simon's old university. "I know," muttered the sick man, "that at this very moment thousands of men are dying. Death is everywhere. It's neither infrequent nor extraordinary. I'm resigned to dying soon, but before that I want to talk about an experience which is torturing me. Otherwise I cannot die in peace." He was breathing heavily. I had the feeling that he was staring at me through his head bandage. Perhaps he could see through the yellow stains, although they were nowhere near his eyes. I could not look at him. I heard from one of the sisters that there were Jewish prisoners working in the courtyard, he said. Previously she had brought me a letter from my mother. She read it out to me and then went away. I've been here for 3 months. Then I came to the decision, after thinking it over for a long time though. When the sister came back, I asked her to help me. I wanted her to fetch a Jewish prisoner to me, but I warned that she must be careful that no one must see her. The nurse, who had no idea why I had made this request, didn't reply and went away. I gave up all hope of her taking such a risk for my sake. But when she came in a little while ago, she bent over me and whispered that there was a Jew outside. She said that she was complying with the last wish of a dying man. She knows how it is with me. I'm in a death chamber. That I know. They let the hopeless cases die alone. Perhaps they don't want the others to be upset. Who was this man to whom I was listening? What was he trying to say to me, Simon thought. Was he a Jew who had camouflaged himself as a German and now on his deathbed wanted to look at a Jew again? According to gossip, in the ghetto and later in the camp, there were Jews in Germany who were Aryan in appearance and had enlisted in the army with false papers. They had even got into the SS. That was their method of survival. Was this man such a Jew, or perhaps a half-Jew, son of a mixed marriage? When he made a slight movement, I noticed that his other hand rested on a letter, but which now had slipped to the floor. I bent down and put it back on the counterpane. I didn't touch his hand, and he could not have seen my movement. Nevertheless, he reacted. "Thank you. That is my mother's letter." The words came softly from his lips, and again I had the feeling he was staring at me. His hand groped for the letter and drew it towards him, as if he hoped to derive a little strength and courage from contact with the paper. I thought of my own mother, who would never write me another letter. 5 weeks previously she had been dragged out of the ghetto in a raid. The only article of value which she still possessed after all the looting was a gold watch which I had given to my mother so that she might be able to buy herself off when they came to fetch her. A neighbour who had valid papers told me later what had happened to the watch. My mother gave it to a Ukrainian policeman who came to arrest her. He went away, but soon came back and bundled my mother and others into the truck that carried them away to the place from which no letters ever emerged. Time seemed to stand still as I listened to the croaking of the dying man. "My name is Karl," he said. "I joined the SS as a volunteer. Of course, when you hear the word SS..." He stopped. His throat seemed to be dry and he tried hard to swallow a lump in it. Now I know he couldn't be a Jew or a half-Jew who had hidden inside a German uniform. How could I have imagined such a thing? But in those days, anything was possible. "I must tell you something dreadful," he said. "Something inhumane. It happened a year ago." "Has a year already gone by?" These last words he spoke almost to himself. Yes, it's a year, he continued. A year since the crime. The crime I committed. I have to talk to someone about it. Perhaps that will help. Then his hand grasped mine. His fingers clutched mine tightly, as though he sensed I was trying unconsciously to withdraw my hand, especially when he used the word crime. Whence had he derived the strength? Or was it that I was so weak that I could not take my hand away? I must tell you this horrible deed, he said. Tell you because you are a Jew. Could there be some kind of horror unknown to us? All the atrocities and tortures that a sick brain can invent are familiar to me. I have felt them on my own body, said Simon, and I have seen them happen in the camp. Any story that this sick man had to tell couldn't surpass the horror stories which my comrades in the camp exchanged with each other every night. I wasn't really curious about his story, and inwardly I only hoped the nurse had remembered to tell the askari where I was. Otherwise, they would be looking for me. Perhaps they would think I'd escaped. I was uneasy. I could hear voices outside the door, but I recognized one as the nurse's voice, and that reassured me. The strangled voice went on. Some time elapsed before I realized what guilt I had incurred, he said. I stared at the bandaged head. I didn't know what he wanted to confess, but I knew for sure that after his death a sunflower would grow on his grave. Already a sunflower was turning towards the window through which the sun was sending its rays into the death chamber. Why was the sunflower already making its appearance? Because it would accompany him to the cemetery, I thought, and stand on his grave and sustain his connection with life. And this I envied. I envied him also because in his last moments he was able to think of a live mother who would be grieving for him. I was not born a murderer, he wheezed. His breath heavily and he went silent. I come from Stuttgart and I'm now 21. That's too soon to die. I've had very little out of life. Of course it's too soon to die, I thought. But did the Nazis ask whether our children, whom they were about to gas, had ever had anything out of life themselves? Did they ask whether it was too soon for them to die? Certainly nobody had ever asked me that question. As if he guessed my mental reaction, he said, I know what you're thinking, and I understand. But may I not still say that I'm too young? Then in a burst of calm coherency he went on. My father, who was a manager of a factory, was a convinced social democrat. After 1933 he got into difficulties, but that happened to so many. My mother brought me up as a Catholic. I was actually a server in the church and a special favourite of our priest, who hoped that I would one day study theology, but it turned out differently. I joined the Hitler Youth, and that of course was the end of the church for me. My mother was very sad, but finally stopped reproaching me. I was her only child. My father never uttered a word on the subject. He was afraid lest I should talk in the Hitler Youth about what I had heard at home. Our leader demanded that we should champion our cause everywhere, even at home. He told us that if we heard any abuse, we must report it to him. And there were many who did so, but not I. My parents nevertheless were afraid, and they stopped talking when I was near. Their mistrust annoyed me, but unfortunately there was no time for reflection in those days. In the Hitler Youth I found friends and comrades. My days were full. After school, most of our class hurried to the clubhouse or sports ground. My father rarely spoke to me, and when he had something to say, he spoke cautiously, with reserve. I know what depressed him. Often I watched him sitting in his armchair for hours, brooding without saying a word. When war broke out, I volunteered naturally in the SS. I was far from being the only one in my troop to do so. Almost half of them joined the forces voluntarily without a thought, as if they were going to a dance or on an outing. My mother wept when I left. As I closed the door behind me, I heard my father say, "They are taking our son from us. No good is going to come of this." His words made me indignant. I wanted to go back and argue with him. I wanted to tell him that he simply did not understand modern times. But I let it be, so as not to make my departure worse for all of us by an ugly scene. Those words were the last I ever heard my father speak. Occasionally he would add a few lines to my mother's letters, but my mother usually made excuses by saying he was not back from work and he was anxious to catch the post. She was anxious to catch the post. He paused and groped with his hand for the glass on the night table. Although he could not see it, he knew where it was. He drank a mouthful of water and put the glass back safely in its place before I could do it for him. Was he really in such a bad way as he had said? He went on. We were first sent to a training camp at an army base, where we listened feverishly to the radio messages about the Polish campaign. We devoured the reports in the newspapers and dreaded that our services might not after all be needed. I was longing for experience to see the world, to be able to recount my adventures. My uncle had such exciting tales to tell of the war in Russia, how they had driven Ivan into the Masurian lakes. I wanted to play my part in that sort of thing. I sat there like a cat on hot bricks and tried to release my hand from his. I wanted to go away, but he seemed to be trying to talk to me with his hands as well as his voice. His grip grew tighter, as if pleading with me not to desert him. Perhaps his hand was a replacement for his eyes. I looked around the room and, glancing at the window, I saw a part of the sun-drenched courtyard with the shadow of the roof crossing it obliquely, a boundary between light and dark, a defined boundary without any transition. So we'll continue next week with the story of the meeting with Simon and the dying SS soldier. So Shabbat Shalom, Mike Fryer.